When people in the late 19th century spoke of progress, they often spoke with glowing pride about their institutions. The great buildings that rose in brick and stone across the landscape, designed not only to house but to symbolize a new way of thinking. Among these were the asylums, structures that many believed would change the way society treated its most fragile members. Before their rise, the mentally ill were often cast out, locked in basements, chained in barns, or simply abandoned to wander the streets, feared as much as pitied. Reformers of the period saw this cruelty and promised something different: places of safety, sanctuaries where light, order, and medical care would replace the shadows of neglect. The asylum, they said, would be a healing palace, a triumph of science over superstition, and of compassion over shame. The one that would later hold the 42 patients was raised during this wave of optimism. Construction began in the 1880s, a time when architecture itself was used as a kind of therapy. The building was vast and deliberate in its design. Tall arched windows were intended to let in sunlight, long corridors with high ceilings to allow air to circulate, gardens and walking paths to encourage calm. Even the red brick was chosen to look warm and solid, a comforting alternative to the cold stone of prisons. Pamphlets of the day described the asylum in almost religious terms, comparing it to a cathedral of healing, where the afflicted minds of men and women might be soothed by both science and nature. Families who visited the grounds before admitting their loved ones often spoke of its serene appearance. They believed, sincerely, that they were entrusting their kin to something better than what the outside world could offer. Doctors at the time promised cures through what they called moral treatment. It was an idea born in Europe and adopted eagerly in America, suggesting that with kindness, structure, and gentle routines, even the most troubled patient could find stability. The asylum became the place where this philosophy was meant to blossom. Patients would rise with the sun, walk in the fresh air, engage in quiet tasks like weaving, gardening, or painting. They would be shielded from the chaos of city streets, from the gossip of neighbors, from the judgment of churches. For many families, it sounded almost too good to be true, a place where suffering could be contained, softened, perhaps even erased. But within the walls, the reality was not so simple. By the time the asylum officially opened its doors, the tide of patients was greater than anyone anticipated. In its first year, admissions exceeded capacity by nearly a third. The optimism of reformers clashed with the practical demands of overcrowding, underfunding, and a lack of trained staff. The bright windows grew grimy, the air less fresh, the corridors noisier. Still, the vision persisted, at least in the words of officials. They continued to market the asylum as a beacon of progress, a proud emblem of civilization's march toward kindness. What they did not advertise was the quiet hierarchy that already ruled the place. Wealthier families who paid more for their relatives secured better rooms, more attention, sometimes even a chance at release. Poorer patients, those sent by counties or parishes, found themselves in crowded wards, where a single nurse might oversee dozens. These disparities were not seen as scandalous at the time. They were simply accepted as part of life. Yet they planted the first seeds of betrayal in what was meant to be a sanctuary. Still, from the outside, the asylum remained a source of fascination. Visitors came on tours, journalists wrote glowing reviews, and reformers from other states praised its humane vision. The town nearby prospered, too, supplying goods and staff. The asylum's looming profile became part of the local landscape, a reminder to all who passed that science and compassion could now be housed in brick and mortar. No one questioned whether the promises made were truly being kept behind those locked doors. It is easy now to look back and see the cracks forming, the inevitable collapse of ideals under the weight of human imperfection. But at that moment, in history, the asylum embodied the best and worst of its age. It showed a hunger for progress and a blind trust in authority. It showed a desire to heal, but also a willingness to hide away what society found uncomfortable. Families who delivered their sons and daughters at the asylum gates often felt relief, even pride, believing they had done the right thing. They had no way of knowing that, for some, those gates would never open again. This tension between promise and reality hung in the air from the very beginning. The halls echoed not only with footsteps and murmured prayers, but with the unspoken fear that the line between sanctuary and prison might be thinner than anyone wanted to admit. For the doctors and nurses, the pressure to deliver cures that science could not yet provide created a climate ripe for shortcuts, for experiments, for decisions justified in the name of progress. And for the patients themselves, the asylum's towering walls often felt less like protection than containment. The gardens less like freedom than a cage with flowers. The rise of the asylum, then, was not just the story of one building, but of an era's faith in control. Faith that human suffering could be neatly contained if only the right walls were built, the right routines imposed, the right experts placed in charge. It was this faith that would eventually allow 42 people to enter, to disappear into the West Wing, and to be swallowed by silence for decades. Their story begins not with a scream or a locked door, but with the confident speeches of reformers, the applause of townsfolk, and the opening of iron gates that gleamed with promise. The very thing meant to heal became the stage for what would later be remembered as one of the darkest betrayals in the history of mental health care. But in the beginning, it was all hope. It was all progress. It was the dawn of something that looked, to those who did not peer too closely, like compassion, made flesh and brick. What began as a monument to progress quickly turned into something far less noble. The walls that had been raised to shelter the vulnerable became, in practice, barriers that concealed them from view. The promise of light and air was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of bodies crammed into spaces never designed to hold them. As the asylum's reputation grew, more families sent their troubled kin, more county officials signed orders of commitment, and the carefully balanced ideal of moral treatment buckled under the weight of reality. Within a decade of its grand opening, the institution was overcrowded, underfunded, and stretched to a breaking point that administrators were too proud or too afraid to admit. The philosophy of gentle healing gave way to a harsher Nurses who had once been instructed to treat patients as fragile souls now referred to them as cases, numbers, or burdens. Doctors, faced with mounting pressure to demonstrate results, began to reach for quicker methods, restraints when patients failed, cold water immersions when calm could not be restored, and, later, the crude beginnings of electrotherapy. The lofty speeches of reformers faded into the background, replaced by the daily grind of managing chaos. Patients no longer walked freely through sunlit gardens. They were herded into locked wards, where the smell of unwashed bodies and disinfectant mixed into a pungent fog. It was here, in the wards, that the promises of compassion fell apart most visibly. Those who were restless, or spoke too loudly, were silenced with leather straps. Those who resisted were dosed with sedatives, the liquid poured down their throats by attendants with no medical training. Those who sank into quiet despair were often left to rot in corners, their food trays left untouched, their existence barely acknowledged. The staff, exhausted and underpaid, justified their actions as necessary. After all, how could one nurse provide kindness to 30 screaming patients with no relief in sight? The asylum had been designed to heal individuals. In reality, it was warehousing them. As the decades turned, the institution began to drift into secrecy. Families who visited were shown the manicured gardens and the few patients who had recovered enough to appear composed. They were not shown the locked rooms where screams reverberated, where patients tore at their own skin, or where attendants punished with beatings that went unrecorded. Paperwork was manipulated, omissions justified as administrative oversight. What mattered most was the appearance of progress, not the reality of suffering. And yet, beneath the cruelty, there was also an air of something more insidious: curiosity. The medical field was expanding rapidly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and mental illness was one of its greatest mysteries. The asylum became a laboratory of sorts, a place where desperate families provided bodies upon which to test theories. Ice baths, extended isolation, experimental drugs, these were not considered abuse by those who wielded them, but innovations, attempts to peel back the darkness of the human mind. Whether the patients survived the ordeal, whether they improved or withered, mattered less than the fact that something had been tried. In this climate, suffering became data, and people became test subjects, whose consent was never sought. The shift from sanctuary to prison was subtle, but relentless. Locked doors multiplied. Windows that once admitted light were barred. Patients found themselves punished for speaking out of turn, for resisting treatment, even for crying too loudly. Daily life grew regimented, not for the sake of recovery, but for the ease of staff. Wake at dawn. Line up for meager meals. Sit for hours in silence. Lights out before nightfall. Those who broke the rhythm were restrained, sedated, or sent to solitary cells where walls closed in like coffins. Slowly, individuality was stripped away until each person became merely another body in a bed, another line in a ledger. The families outside did not know, or perhaps they chose not to ask. They signed admission papers and trusted authority, comforted by the knowledge that their loved ones were in good hands. Many never visited after the initial handover, believing that distance was part of the cure. In truth, that distance made concealment easier. The fewer eyes from the outside, the freer the institution became to bend rules, to hide failings, to erase mistakes. But not everyone within the asylum was blind. A handful of staff whispered of abuses, of patients whose conditions worsened rather than improved, of experiments conducted without oversight. Yet whistleblowers were silenced with threats to their positions or their reputations. A doctor who spoke too loudly of ethical concerns suddenly found himself transferred to another facility. A nurse who questioned the long hours of ice immersion was dismissed for insubordination. The institution defended itself fiercely, guarding its image even as the truth rotted behind its walls. It was during this period of decline that the idea of hopeless cases began to take hold. Patients who did not respond to treatment after a certain period were written off as incurable. Once that label was stamped on a file, care shifted from recovery to containment. These were the men and women who vanished into the forgotten corners of the asylum, the basement wards, the attic rooms, the sealed corridors where staff rarely ventured except to deliver food or tighten restraints. They became invisible too. Records, invisible to visitors, invisible even to hope. What made this transformation particularly chilling was how easily it was justified. Administrators spoke of efficiency. Doctors invoked the needs of science. Attendants muttered about order and safety. And all the while, the language of compassion remained in the brochures and speeches, a mask that reassured the public, while cruelty thrived in the shadows. The very words that had drawn families to the asylum, healing, safety, hope, were weaponized to conceal the reality of neglect and experimentation. For those trapped inside, the sense of betrayal was profound. Many had entered with trust, brought by families who believed they were being offered a chance. Some had been promised that their stay would be temporary, that recovery was within reach. But as months turned into years, and as the methods of care grew harsher, the realization sank in that the asylum was not a doorway back into society, but a final destination. Patients began to speak of the building as a tomb, a place where they were buried alive behind walls of brick and bureaucracy. It was within this bleak environment that the story of the 42 would take root. They arrived into a system already corrupted by neglect and sustained by secrecy. They stepped across the threshold believing, perhaps dimly, that they would find help. Instead, they entered a machine that had learned how to consume people quietly, to erase them without scandal, to bury them in wards where records could be falsified and voices could be silenced. The ideals of moral treatment were long gone by then, replaced by a culture that saw patients less as lives to be saved than as problems to be managed, or opportunities to be studied. The asylum that had once stood as a beacon of hope had by then become a place where human suffering was routine, where compassion was rationed, and where cruelty could be mistaken for science. It is in this atmosphere of failed promises and institutional rot that the mystery of the 42 begins to unfold, and it is why their disappearance would shock even those who thought they already knew how far the asylum had fallen. They did not arrive all at once in a single wagon, but trickled through the gates over the course of a bleak winter, bundled in coats, escorted by deputies, husbands, fathers, or sometimes no one at all. Yet the records from the asylum show something uncanny. 42 admissions between November and February. A clustering so precise that even in hindsight it looks less like coincidence than orchestration. Each patient was logged with a file number, but what made them remarkable was not only their number, but their variety. They came from different counties, different walks of life, and yet, within weeks, they all found themselves in the same place, the West Wing, a ward set apart from the others, sealed by heavy doors that most attendants were forbidden to enter. Some of their names survive, though many were later erased from official ledgers. There was a school teacher from a rural village whose diagnosis read melancholia brought on by excessive worry. A farmer's wife was committed for hysterical spells after the death of her child. One young man, barely 17, was sent by his father with the vague notation fits of imagination. Another entry simply listed disobedient and unmanageable. None of these conditions, by modern standards, would justify permanent confinement. But in that time, when families carried shame like an infection, an asylum offered an easy solution, out of sight, out of mind. For the patients themselves, the journey to the asylum marked a moment of fracture. Some fought against the men who held them, screaming until their voices cracked. Others shuffled silently, hollow-eyed, perhaps already resigned. A few believed they were going to a place of rest, and even expressed relief at the promise of treatment. Their families often left quickly, after handing them over, comforted by the official tone of the doctors, the sight of brick walls and uniformed attendants. They rarely lingered long enough to see the West Wing doors shut behind their loved ones, or to hear the clanging echo of locks that would not open again. Inside, the 42 were not placed among the general population. Instead, they were taken to the upper floors of the West Wing, where corridors narrowed and light grew scarce. The windows there were smaller, some shuttered, some barred. The rooms were lined, not with comfortable beds, but iron frames, thin mattresses, leather straps dangling from the sides. Attendants told the patients it was temporary, that this wing was for observation, that soon they would join the others. But the days passed, then weeks, and still they remained apart. What made their confinement stranger was the secrecy that surrounded it. Nurses who had served in the asylum for years noticed that supplies were delivered to the West Wing separately, often under lock and key. Meals were prepared in the main kitchen but carried away by a small, trusted group of attendants. Doctors who rarely ventured into the noisier wards spent long hours there, emerging with notebooks and locked satchels. When junior staff asked about the purpose of the wing, they were told curtly that the patients inside were special cases. No further explanation followed, and few dared to press. Yet fragments of their lives seeped through the cracks. One orderly, sympathetic but terrified of punishment, smuggled a note from a woman inside. In shaky handwriting, she wrote, "They call us by number now, not name. We are told to keep quiet, but at night the locks turn twice, and we hear the others crying through the walls." Another testimony survives from a nurse, who was dismissed after refusing to administer what she described as the tonic, a bitter liquid forced upon patients that left them lethargic, their eyes glassy, their movements stiff. She swore that after several doses, Patients ceased speaking altogether, as if their voices had been chemically stolen. For the 42 daily life blurred into a ritual of control. They were woken before dawn, lined up for inspection, dosed with mixtures that tasted of metal or alcohol, then left in silence for hours. Some were strapped into chairs in the day room, others confined to their beds. The rare moments of interaction were tinged with menace. Doctors asked questions that made little sense about dreams, about visions, about whether they heard voices no one else could. Patients who answered hesitantly were prodded. Those who refused were struck. Over time, fear taught them to answer with whatever words seemed safest. What is most chilling about their confinement is how deliberately it was hidden. The asylum maintained regular census reports, which were reviewed by state officials. Yet, in those years, the pages reveal blank spaces, rows where names should have been, replaced with dashes or numbers. Officially, the 42 were not missing, they simply never existed on paper. For their families, attempts to inquire were met with evasions. Letters went unanswered, visits postponed with excuses of illness or transfer. A few persistent relatives traveled to the asylum demanding proof, only to be shown unrelated patients, or told that their kin had been discharged without notice. These explanations, though implausible, were accepted more often than not. The stigma of mental illness kept families from pressing too hard. To question too loudly risked drawing shame upon themselves. Among the patients, bonds formed despite the enforced silence. They communicated in whispers, in coded glances, in the scratching of fingernails along the iron bed frames. Some devised signals to let one another know they were still alive, still resisting in the smallest of ways. Others succumbed to despair, lying motionless for hours, their minds unraveling in the oppressive stillness. The ward became a world of its own, cut off from the asylum at large. Governed by rules no outsider could see, whispers spread among the staff. Some claimed that doctors were attempting new forms of treatment, surgical procedures done in secret, injections of untested compounds. Others said the patients were chosen precisely because they were unlikely to be missed, plucked from poor families or isolated communities, where no one had the means to investigate. Whether by chance or design, the 42 represented lives, deemed expendable, bodies that could vanish without scandal. What unites the scattered records, testimonies, and fragments that remain is the sense of erasure. These people were not simply confined, they were removed from the flow of normal asylum life, erased from documents, hidden from visitors, denied the minimal dignity granted to others in confinement. They lived in a twilight space where their existence was acknowledged only enough to sustain their captivity, and denied enough to conceal it. For those outside, the asylum still shone as a symbol of progress. Tours were conducted through the manicured gardens. Journalists praised the administration, and visiting officials congratulated themselves on their benevolence. No one was led up the narrow staircases of the West Wing. No one heard the muffled cries behind its doors, or saw the patients with their numbers stitched into uniforms where names should have been. The asylum maintained its mask of healing, while behind it 42 lives withered slowly, suspended between being and oblivion. They had entered expecting treatment, some perhaps even believing in it. What they found instead was disappearance from the world, then from the records, and finally, from themselves. Their story begins in those months of quiet admissions, when the gate swung open again and again, delivering them into a place that had already forgotten how to heal. The silence of the West Wing was not the silence of peace, but of suppression. The kind of silence that grows thick in the air, pressing down on the chest, demanding obedience. It was in this suffocating quiet that rumors began to take shape, rumors, whispered by attendants in hurried tones, by dismissed nurses to sympathetic ears, by patients themselves, in scraps of words smuggled on torn fabric or scratched into the underside of bed frames. The whispers spoke of treatments that no official report mentioned, of practices that bore little resemblance to care. They spoke of experiments. At first it began with the tonic. Bottles arrived from the city, unlabeled, delivered by trusted men who carried them directly to the physician's quarters. The liquid was bitter, metallic, leaving patients groggy and slow, their eyes unfocused. Some slept for days, others stumbled when forced to walk, limbs jerking as if moved by invisible strings. Nurses were told it was medicine to calm the nerves, but when they asked for dosages or explanations, they were told not to interfere. The tonic, whatever its composition, turned patients pliant, compliant, easy to manipulate. Those who drank it too often lost the ability to form words, their mouths working soundlessly, their thoughts locked behind heavy eyes. Then came the baths. Hydrotherapy had long been used in asylums, but what occurred in the West Wing stretched beyond accepted practice. Patients were submerged in ice-cold water for hours at a time, their bodies shivering violently, teeth clattering, lips turning blue. The stated purpose was to cool the mind, but some were left so long they fainted, their limp forms hauled out, only to be revived and placed back again. Others were wrapped tightly in steaming wet sheets, their limbs restrained, so they could not move, as the heat suffocated them. A nurse later recalled how the walls would drip with condensation, the air reeking of sweat and fear. She was dismissed after refusing to continue. Electrotherapy followed. The asylum had acquired a generator, a gleaming piece of machinery that impressed visiting officials when demonstrated harmlessly on light bulbs. But at night, behind the sealed doors of the West Wing, wires were fastened to temples, currents sent through the skull. Patients convulsed, their screams echoing down the corridors, though muffled by distance and thick walls. The next morning, those same patients sat slack-jawed, their memories fragmented, some unable to recognize their own names. The doctors called this progress. They recorded it carefully in private ledgers, pages filled with clinical detachment that belied the human cost. Whispers spread quickly among the attendants. One spoke of seeing surgical instruments laid out on a tray, scalpels, hammers, chisels, tools, more suited to a workshop than a hospital. Another swore he heard the sound of bone cracking one night, followed by silence that was more chilling than any scream. Rumors of crude lobotomies began to circulate, though no official documentation survives. What remains are stories of patients who once paced, raged, or sang endlessly, suddenly falling into eerie quiet, their gazes vacant, their personalities erased. Isolation was another favored method. Small padded cells, meant for temporary seclusion, became long-term tombs. Patients were left alone for days, with little food or water, their minds unraveling in the darkness. Some clawed at the walls until their fingernails split, others pressed their foreheads to the door and whispered prayers to anyone who might be listening. When attendants finally opened the doors, they found skeletal figures crouched on the floor, rocking endlessly, eyes wide and unseeing. The secrecy of these practices was enforced with brutal efficiency. Staff were warned not to speak of what they saw, reminded that their wages depended on obedience, their reputations on silence. Those who resisted were dismissed or threatened with institutionalization themselves. In an era when accusation could condemn, few dared to push further. The asylum existed in a cocoon of authority. Whatever happened inside its walls was assumed to be necessary, progressive, scientific. The broader public clung to the belief that suffering must be the price of healing, and so they did not question too closely. For the 42, this meant life became a cycle of trials, each more invasive than the last. They were poked, prodded, injected, restrained, observed like specimens. Their individuality, the teacher, the farmer's wife, the boy with restless imagination, was stripped away. They became bodies, test subjects, data points in a ledger meant to impress medical journals that never came. Some resisted fiercely, their cries reverberating through the West Wing until throats bled. Others submitted in numb silence, the will to fight beaten down by repetition. A few tried to end their suffering, fashioning nooses from bedsheets or shards from broken crockery. Most attempts failed, thwarted by ever-present attendants. Those who survived such attempts were punished with even harsher treatments, as if despair itself was a form of rebellion. Occasionally, a sliver of humanity broke through. One nurse, before her dismissal, recalled sitting beside a woman after a brutal electrotherapy session. The woman's hair was singed at the temples, her body trembling uncontrollably. She whispered, barely audible, "They are taking pieces of us away." The nurse could not forget those words, etched into her memory long after she was forced from the asylum. The experiments were justified with lofty rhetoric. Doctors spoke of advancing science, of unlocking the mysteries of the human mind, of relieving future generations of the burden of madness. They wrote letters to colleagues in distant cities, boasting of innovations, while never disclosing the full extent of their methods. To them, the suffering of the 42 was collateral damage, unfortunate but necessary. Each scream was another step toward progress, each broken body another lesson learned. But among the patients, the sense of doom grew. They whispered to one another, in the rare moments of respite, comparing the burns on their skin, the scars on their scalps, the gaps in their memories. They began to suspect that they would never leave the West Wing alive. The promise of healing had curdled into a realization of captivity. They were not patients to be cured, but subjects to be consumed. Each day another experiment, another step deeper into a nightmare with no escape. By the time the blizzard of 1896 sealed the asylum off from the outside world, the 42 were already ghosts in waiting. Their bodies remained, but their identities had been eroded by tonic and shock, by scalpel and isolation. To the staff, they were numbers, experiments half completed, data not yet finished. To themselves, they were fragments, whispers of lives they once remembered dimly, but could no longer hold on to. Their existence was a limbo crafted by men who spoke of science but delivered only suffering. And yet, despite the secrecy, the walls could not contain the whispers forever. Attendants traded stories with others in town, sometimes in hushed tones at taverns, sometimes in nervous confessions to priests. Farmers working near the grounds claimed they heard cries carried on the wind at night, voices that did not sound entirely human. The asylum denied everything, dismissing concerns as superstition. But the rumors persisted, carried from mouth to mouth, becoming darker with each retelling. By the end of that winter, the name of the West Wing was spoken with dread, even among those who did not know exactly why. The whispers of experiments became a shadow story, hidden beneath the official narrative of healing. They lingered in documents half burned, in letters smuggled out, in the haunted eyes of those who worked too close to the truth. They hinted at a secret history within the asylum's walls, a place where progress was built on bones, and where 42 souls became unwilling witnesses to the dark side of medicine. The whispers that trickled out of those asylum walls always began the same way, a story of how the building itself seemed to change after the war years. Doctors returned from battlefield hospitals with grim knowledge of broken minds, and they brought their methods home with them. At first, it was hailed as progress. The city press published polished pieces about the asylum being at the forefront of psychiatric care, offering hope where there had been only despair. Families who had once hidden their troubled kin now brought them here proudly, certain they were gifting them a chance at recovery. The gates of the asylum seemed to open wide, and with them came the surge of new patients. What no one saw was how that surge began to choke the very heart of the institution. Rooms filled beyond their intended number, orderlies stretched themselves thin, and doctors, who had once promised healing, began to lose the patience required to provide it. The name of Dr. Harrow often appears in surviving ledgers. He was praised as a visionary, a man who believed mental illness could be not only managed, but erased with bold interventions. His charisma was magnetic. Families trusted him, Donors supported him, newspapers championed him, but the staff who worked beneath him, whose diaries and letters occasionally surface in forgotten trunks, reveal a darker portrait. He demanded results, not progress. Patients who lingered too long without improvement were seen not as human beings in need of care, but as failures' shadows on his reputation. That obsession seeped into the very routines of the asylum. The treatments became harsher. Hydrotherapy, once meant as soothing immersion, shifted into hours-long icy immersions, meant to shock. Electroconvulsive procedures increased in frequency, administered with such regularity that some patients trembled merely at the sight of the wires. The so-called rest cure became indistinguishable from forced sedation that rendered patients docile for days. There are accounts of patients speaking less and less, not because their conditions improved, but because their words no longer mattered. One nurse wrote that she felt like she was watching candles snuffed out, one, by invisible hands. The silence in the halls grew heavy, oppressive. It wasn't the silence of peace, but of suppression and enforced quiet where voices no longer dared to rise. And yet the outside world still thought of this place as a sanctuary. The newspaper clippings from the late 1920s describe a model institution, though those same years in the records show spikes in unexplained patient deaths. Pneumonia, heart failure, malnutrition, they appear again and again in the death logs, vague causes with no detail, no autopsies, no accountability. For the 42 who would never leave, the system itself became their executioner. Most of their names were struck from the rosters in the decades that followed, erased under the justification of poor record-keeping. But fragments of their existence linger. Letters never mailed, written in trembling hands, and hidden between mattress seams. Journals confiscated by staff, only to resurface later in estate sales and archives. Each one paints a picture not of healing, but of confinement that grew more severe with every passing year. One such letter, found in the bottom drawer of a desk sold at auction, tells of a patient named Elsie. She wrote to her sister that she had begged to be allowed outside into the gardens, only to be locked away for agitation. The next entry in the ledger notes her death from exhaustion, a cruel euphemism that likely masked something more sinister. As the 1930s loomed, money grew tighter, and resources dwindled. The asylum's outward face remained were given two wealthy benefactors, showing off bright wards with carefully selected patients who smiled on command. Behind closed doors, however, the 42 were being shuffled deeper into the institution, into wards no visitors ever saw. Some staff members later confessed that they avoided those wings whenever possible, saying the stench of decay lingered there, a mingling of illness, unwashed bodies, and despair. They spoke of feeling watched, as if the patients themselves had merged with the building's shadowed corners, their suffering etched into the very mortar. One attendant, whose memoir was privately published decades later, described an unforgettable night. He was delivering medication in the West Wing when he heard a low humming. It wasn't machinery, he insisted, but human voices, 42 of them. He claimed humming in unison, yet when he opened the door, the patients sat in silence, staring blankly, as though they had never moved their lips. He left the ward shaken, never returning to it. Such stories are easily dismissed as the inventions of a guilty conscience, but when repeated by multiple staff across decades, they form a disturbing pattern. The reality was simpler, though no less tragic. The patients who entered those doors with fragile hope never received the care they were promised. They were buried under experiments, disguised as treatments, their autonomy stripped away piece by piece, until they became little more than test subjects, sustaining the asylum's reputation. For Dr. Harrow and those like him, the measure of success was not the restoration of lives, but the maintenance of his image in medical journals and city records. And when patients did not fit that narrative, they were pushed aside, forgotten, or silenced. The institution that had begun as a beacon gradually transformed into a labyrinth without exits. For the 42, every corridor led deeper into obscurity. Their deaths, unmarked and unacknowledged, became statistics in annual reports. Yet their absence spoke louder than any words. The staff who remained long enough to witness the decline reported a growing unease, as though the very building had turned hostile. Doors jammed without explanation, lights flickered in rooms where no electrical fault could be found, and patients, who could barely speak, would whisper the same word over and over: "Stay." Whether it was a plea or a curse, no one could decide. The world outside carried on, oblivious, while within those walls, the cycle of neglect hardened into permanence. What had been created as a healing refuge became indistinguishable from a tomb, its victims alive long enough to feel the betrayal before being swallowed by it. Their stories were never meant to be told, yet scraps remain, like fragments of bone unearthed from forgotten soil, refusing to be hidden forever. And from those fragments emerges the truth that this was not simply the result of failed medicine or insufficient resources. It was the slow, deliberate erasure of human beings, sealed within walls meant to protect them. Their final moments, whether in silence or resistance, are lost to time. What remains is the certainty that they did not leave by choice. The asylum's reputation began to shift slowly, not with a dramatic event, but through whispers, rumors, and the uneasy silence that clung to the building's hallways. At first, the stories were dismissed as exaggerations, the kind of tales one would expect from a place housing the disturbed and broken. But as the years passed, the whispers hardened into a reputation, and the asylum that had been founded as a sanctuary of healing became synonymous with dread. Visitors spoke of feeling watched, even in empty rooms, and staff members reported sudden drops in temperature, strange noises at night, and a weight in the air that made it difficult to breathe. The asylum seemed to develop a personality of its own, cold, unforgiving, hungry. What marked the beginning of the descent was not one great tragedy, but an accumulation of neglect. Supplies meant for the patients were cut short as funding dwindled. Those once promised cutting-edge treatments found themselves reduced to meager meals and long stretches of confinement. Doctors who once walked the halls with ambition became weary and indifferent, their curiosity curdling into cruelty. Restraints replaced therapy, silence replaced conversation, and the human beings who had entered its gates became shadows of themselves, abandoned to the echoes of the walls. The institution was no longer a place of recovery. It was a warehouse of the forgotten. Patients began to die not in great violent events that drew headlines, but quietly, in corners where no one was watching. Malnutrition claimed some, untreated infections others. A patient who had once painted vivid landscapes on scraps of discarded paper was found stiff in his bed one morning, a fever burning him from within, unattended, until it was too late. Another, who had once told stories of his childhood on a farm, starved himself after weeks of begging for food that never arrived in enough quantity. Death became an unspoken part of the asylum's rhythm, like the chiming of a clock. But it was not only death that lingered. Strange occurrences began to rattle even the most skeptical staff. Doors that had been locked at night were found open in the morning. Patients who could not walk were found sitting in different positions, as if moved by unseen hands. Nurses whispered of voices carried down the hallways, pleas for water, cries for release only to find the wards empty. The asylum seemed alive, with the restless energy of its captives, both living and dead. Those who dared to speak about the strange atmosphere were often dismissed. Administrators warned staff not to encourage superstitious nonsense, and punishments awaited those who spread tales of haunting. But the silence did not make the stories disappear. In fact, it only made them more powerful. One orderly recalled leaving his post late one night and seeing a group of patients lined up at the end of the corridor, standing perfectly still. He assumed they were real until he walked closer, Then the figures melted into the darkness, leaving only the sound of faint sobbing. Another nurse swore she felt her arm gripped by invisible fingers while she was delivering medicine, the pressure so strong she dropped the tray. The local community, too, began to feel the change. Families who had once visited their loved ones regularly began to hesitate. They spoke of a smell that clung to them after leaving, an odor of rot and dampness that no washing could remove. Some claimed that their relatives looked different each time they visited, not only thinner and weaker, but as though their very essence had been drained. Eventually, many stopped visiting altogether, unable to bear the weight of despair that seemed to cling to the asylum. The institution grew increasingly isolated, both physically and socially. The gates that once welcomed visitors became barriers, and the townspeople began avoiding the road that passed by. Superstition painted the asylum as cursed, a place where souls were trapped in endless suffering. Children dared one another to walk past at night, swearing they heard cries carried on the wind. Even the clergy, who once came to offer blessings and comfort, visited less frequently, whispering among themselves that the place was beyond salvation. It was in this atmosphere of decay and dread that the asylum's true transformation solidified. The patients no longer had names in the eyes of the staff. They were numbers, tasks to be completed, burdens to be managed. When one of them died, the body was often left 4 hours before removal, a stark reminder to the others of their own fate. Graves were dug in the asylum's yard, shallow and unmarked, reducing lives once rich with memories, families, and identities into anonymous mounds of earth. The haunting was no longer confined to ghostly whispers and apparitions. It seeped into the minds of the living, shaping their actions. A doctor known for his cold demeanor began reporting vivid nightmares in which patients surrounded his bed, their mouths sewn shut, their eyes filled with accusation. An orderly, hardened by years of work, suddenly quit after claiming he heard a patient repeating his name in a guttural, inhuman voice during the night, though the patient in question had died 2 days earlier. Those who remained grew numb, their humanity eroded, as though the asylum fed not only on the vulnerable patients, but also on those sworn to care for them. The decay of the asylum mirrored the decay of its purpose. What had once been envisioned as a refuge of hope had inverted into its opposite, a place where healing was impossible, where suffering was endless, where the line between the living and the dead blurred beyond recognition. Every brick, every corridor seemed saturated with anguish. The air carried not just the weight of the present, but of all who had passed within those walls. Every cry, every desperate plea, every silent resignation imprinted into its fabric. By the time outsiders began to question what had truly transpired inside, the damage was already irreversible. The asylum was no longer just a building. It had become a tomb, not only for the bodies buried in its grounds, but for the dreams of what it had once promised to be. It stood as a monument to neglect, a place where the human spirit was extinguished, quietly, away from the eyes of the world. And as whispers of its history spread, they carried not only the stories of those who died there, but also the warning that some places once corrupted can never be cleansed. The final days of the asylum's operation did not come with the abrupt closure one might expect. There was no government decree, no dramatic evacuation of patients, no final goodbyes. Instead, it was a slow death, much like the decline of the very souls trapped inside. By the late 1970s, the once proud institution had been reduced to a rotting carcass of peeling plaster, rusted pipes, and corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly into shadow. The staff dwindled, funding was cut to the bone, and yet, inexplicably, the patients remained. Records suggest that in those final years there were still 42 souls residing within its walls, though residing may be far too kind a word for what truly transpired. There is evidence to suggest that the asylum had become a place few outsiders dared to enter. Whispers of the conditions within, patients left in soiled clothes, food arriving in irregular intervals, the sick housed alongside the violent maid, even seasoned inspectors, reluctant to step inside. Some claimed that officials in power knew exactly what was happening, that to acknowledge the asylum's decline would require resources they were unwilling to give. It was easier to look away, to allow the forgotten to remain forgotten. And so, the gates stayed locked, and the cries of those 42 echoed only to the cracked walls that contained them. Neighbors living within earshot of the asylum often spoke of strange sounds drifting on the night air, a low moaning that rose and fell like a chant, sudden bursts of screams carried on the wind. At first, the locals rationalized it. After all, it was a hospital, and hospitals often echoed with suffering. But as the years wore on and staff numbers dropped, the frequency of those sounds grew, until it no longer seemed like cries being answered, but simply cries left unanswered. Some villagers reported seeing thin faces at the windows, staring blankly into the night, their eyes unblinking. Others swore they saw figures moving in the grounds at odd hours, even though there were no guards left to patrol. By 1982, the institution had effectively become self-governing. A skeleton crew of attendants showed up sporadically, delivering food or supplies, but rarely venturing beyond the first 2 wards. Patients deeper within were left to fend for themselves, a society of the abandoned. Rumors abound of how they survived trading rations, carving up territories, creating strange hierarchies in which the most aggressive claimed dominance, while the frail shrank into corners. There were whispers, too, of something darker, that when supplies faltered and hunger grew unbearable, the patients turned on one another in ways too gruesome to fully detail. Though official records deny it, the state of the remains later found suggested otherwise. The death toll began quietly. An emaciated woman found slumped against the wall of Ward C, her body left for days before anyone noticed. A young man who vanished, later discovered locked in a storage closet, his hands bloodied from clawing at the wood. These were not singular tragedies but a slow, relentless roll call of silence. One by one, the voices faded until the asylum grew quieter, not with peace, but with absence. 42 souls, dwindling in number, yet curiously, no records of official burials were ever kept. Where did they go? Some say the earth around the asylum hides them still, shallow graves dug hurriedly by desperate hands. Others suggest their bones rest within the walls themselves, the institution consuming those who could never escape. The final patient deaths remain the greatest mystery. In 1984, a maintenance worker entered the asylum after weeks of unanswered messages from the dwindling staff. What he found would become the subject of endless speculation. The wards were silent, dust coating the floor so thick it muted his footsteps. He reported that many of the rooms were empty, the beds stripped bare, as though the inhabitants had vanished. But then, in one locked wing, he claimed to find them, what was left of them, bodies, emaciated and contorted, huddled together in corners, some still seated in chairs, their heads bowed as if in prayer. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of a violent raid. It was as if the life had simply drained from them, all at once. The official statement offered a bland explanation: malnutrition, neglect, perhaps exposure to illness that spread unchecked. Yet survivors who had once worked there told different stories. One nurse recalled a pervasive sense of dread in those final weeks, describing how patients spoke of shadows that crept through the halls at night, whispering promises only they could hear. Another attendant, long since dismissed, swore that the patients had begun to behave in eerie unison, chanting in the dark, pacing together as though guided by an unseen hand. Whether madness born of starvation or something unexplainable, these accounts painted a picture not of passive decline, but of something more orchestrated, something deliberate. And then came the silence. After the discovery of the bodies, the asylum was shuttered completely, its records sealed, its halls locked. Officials insisted that the deaths were simply the inevitable outcome of a collapsing institution. the forgotten casualties of bureaucratic negligence. But the locals refused to accept such a tidy narrative. They remembered the cries in the night, the faces in the windows, the strange hush that fell over the grounds in the years before the discovery. They began to say that the asylum itself had claimed its final toll, that what was meant as a place of healing had transformed into a tomb, swallowing those 42 and holding them in its grip even after death. Today, the building still stands, though barely. Its roof sagging, its walls fractured, it remains fenced off and avoided. Wanderers who trespass describe hearing the same sounds once reported by villagers decades before: low moans, footsteps where no one walks, the sudden slam of doors in abandoned corridors. Some claim that the faces are still there, pressed against the windows, unblinking, waiting. And perhaps that is the cruelest fate of all, that the 42 patients who never left the asylum are still there, their bodies long gone, but their presence lingering, tethered to the place that promised them care and delivered only abandonment. The tragedy is not only in their deaths, but in the erasure of their names. Few can recall who they were, what brought them there, or what dreams they once held. They are remembered not as individuals, but as a number, the 42, as though their humanity dissolved with their final breaths. In that way, the asylum succeeded in its cruelest act. It silenced them twice, once in life, once in memory. And perhaps, if the whispers are true, they linger not because they wish to haunt, but because they refuse to be forgotten entirely. If you've stayed with me through this story, you know it's not just about an abandoned asylum, or the 42 patients who never walked out. It's about the way history quietly buries uncomfortable truths, leaving them to rot behind locked doors and ivy-covered walls. We walk past these ruins without realizing the lives, the screams, the silences that are still echoing inside. And maybe, just maybe, by listening to these stories, we are giving those forgotten voices a chance to be heard once more. If you felt something tonight, whether it was unease, curiosity, or even sorrow, then this channel is where you belong. Every week we dive into hidden corners of history, places and people that were never meant to be remembered, but deserve to be. And we do it not just to entertain, but to understand how easily stories like this slip away, how institutions that once promised safety could transform into tombs. I want to hear from you. Do you think the patients were abandoned or erased? Was it negligence, cruelty, or something far darker that sealed their fate? Share your thoughts below in the comments, because your perspective is part of uncovering these truths. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Together, we'll keep peeling back the layers of forgotten history, exposing the shadows that were never meant to see the light. This is only the beginning.